Hey everyone, thank you for joining us tonight. We're going to get started in just a couple minutes, but in the meantime, please share in the chat your name, pronouns, and where you're joining us from. I'm Gabby Lichtenstein. I'm the Tennessee Energy Democracy Field Coordinator at Appalachian Voices. I use she, her pronouns, and I'm based in Knoxville, Tennessee. So I will put that in the chat as an example, but you can see, hopefully, that there's two white icons, both for a chat box and a Q&A box, and we're going to be using both tonight, so try it out. Awesome. So we've got Blacksburg, we've got Asheville, Memphis, Richmond, Shenandoah Valley, Ashland City. Okay, we've got folks starting from a lot of different places. This is awesome. Cool. Charlottesville, Newport, Roanoke, Midlothian. All right, I love to see it. I'm sure folks are going to keep hopping on, but we are going to just kick it off and get started. If you could turn it to the next slide, Jen. All right. So please feel free to keep introducing yourselves in the chat. We're going to start tonight by talking about why we're doing this webinar, and then you'll hear from several of my coworkers at Appalachian Voices, and we'll be tackling what stand out to us as the most common 5 concerns we've been hearing about solar in our communities. So we'll be breaking them down a bit and giving y'all some resources. And then we're really lucky to have with us tonight 2 fantastic guest speakers, Mr. Johnny Rogers, who owns Rogers Cattle Company in North Carolina and uses solar grazing. He's also the amazing grazing program coordinator for North Carolina State University Extension. And after that, we'll hear from Dr. Ronald Myers, who's a professor of practice at Virginia Tech and the director of the Renewable Energy Facilities Siting Project there. And then we're going to wrap up with a question and answer discussion. So if questions come up as we're talking, we encourage you to go ahead and type them in the Q&A feed so we can have that list ready to go. And then, you can share more then too. Next slide. All right. So why are we here tonight? I'd love to hear from y'all in the chat if you want to share your own reasons for showing up, but I'll just share a little bit of context about our reasons for holding this webinar. Solar has the potential to help us all be more self-reliant, save money, and take better care of our land and our people. But we're increasingly encountering the impacts of false information campaigns led by powerful lobbyists and corporations who want to stop us from accessing solar. And we're seeing how this shows up in our communities as real, genuine concerns about the effects of solar. And we know that people want to protect their communities. So we thought it was important to tackle some of these misconceptions together. We'll be talking tonight about reliability, farmland, recycling, what panels are made of, and cost. Now, these are really, really big topics with a lot of nuance, and we're just providing high-level overviews and starting a conversation. Next slide. And right now, there's more funding available than ever before to help us create our own power. The passage of the Inflation Reduction Act and bipartisan infrastructure law provided billions for different clean energy programs. And it's critical our communities aren't left out of these benefits, like saving money, breathing cleaner air, and creating new long-term jobs. You can see here in the left, a solar project on a union apprenticeship building in West Virginia, which the apprentices worked on. And these are just a few of the exciting examples in our region. But for us to get the benefits of solar, we need to dig into the misconceptions. Again, we're focusing tonight on the topics that we've been hearing most in our rural, southeastern, and Appalachian communities. I'm going to turn it over now to my coworker, Matt Allenbaugh, who will get us started.
Good evening, and thank you, Gabby. Yeah, as mentioned, my name is Matt Allenbaugh, and I'm the Virginia Campaign Coordinator with Appalachian Voices, and I'm based in Roanoke, Virginia. And this evening, I'm going to be talking about solar and its reliability. Next slide, please. So we don't expect any of our systems to operate 24/7, 365, whether they're nuclear, coal, or natural gas. So we shouldn't be asking that same thing of renewable energy either. The question we really want to be asking is how do we get to a reliable, carbon-free electricity system in the coming decade? But first, we're going to touch on some of the threats to our current system. All generating facilities experience some downtime, with the average large fossil fuel or nuclear generating facilities being down roughly 7 to 12% of the time, which corresponds to them being unavailable for about 1 month each year. And this is due to, maintenance, refueling, fuel supply issues, and the like. And understanding that all resources are unavailable some of the time, this variability is already being managed by grid operators. One of the biggest threats and uncertainties of overall grid reliability is actually extreme weather events associated with climate change, with both hot and cold temperatures and their impacts on traditional power plants like natural gas and nuclear. And we unfortunately saw exactly this during Winter Storm Elliott in 2022, where outages during an extremely cold snap shortly before Christmas resulted in the fuel supply and equipment freezing in natural gas and coal-fired power plants. And similarly, nuclear is impacted by temperatures as they increase above 85 degrees. Next slide, please. So how do we get there and manage the variability of renewable energy? There are a number of different ways that grid operators are accounting for this now and will increasingly do so in the future. First is through energy storage. This method is already being used in combination with solar as a method of extending the time that that resource is available. Another way it can be managed is through demand flexibility or demand response. And we can think about this as like the smart house or smart metering, where appliances are able to be cycled on and cycled off as clean energy is available without disrupting the functioning or comfort of your home or business. And another way is through a diversified energy portfolio that includes wind, solar, storage, energy efficiency, and demand response. And it's through this broad mix that allows for increased reliability, because any one resource or any one failure has less of an impact on the total system. And we can think about this like our retirement savings, where a diversified portfolio of stocks, bonds, real estate balances out any shocks within the economy and in your savings. Next slide, please. And it's this diversified portfolio strategy that's currently being utilized in Portugal. And Portugal is a really interesting case study of what the clean energy transition might look like in parts of the US in the next several years. Portugal is roughly the same size and population as North Carolina or Virginia. And in late October and early November of last year, Portugal was able to produce enough renewable energy through wind, solar, and hydroelectricity to serve all of its customers for nearly a week. Through this transition, Portugal closed its last coal-fired power plant in 2022, and it expects to stop using natural gas in 2040. Natural gas was available during this time, but it wasn't needed to meet customer needs. And overall, gas use is at its lowest point in Portugal since 2006. They started their clean energy transition in the 1990s with wind and started rapidly adding solar in the early 2010s as prices dropped. Portugal's strategy has focused on diversifying renewable resources and blends each into its fuel mix to make them complementary. And a really important thing to note is that the electricity system in Portugal is actually more reliable than the US average. And a common metric for reliability is SAIDI, or the System Average Interruption Duration Index, which measures electricity outages in minutes. And based on this metric, the average person in Portugal is going to experience roughly half of the outages that an average American is going to see. So as you can see, with Portugal as an example, a more reliable electricity system is already possible with increasing renewable energy. And I'll pass it off to Naomi Albert to talk about the low costs of solar.
Thanks, Matt. My name is Naomi Albert, and I use she, her pronouns, and I'm a North Carolina field coordinator with Appalachian Voices. Today, I'll be discussing the misconception that solar is too expensive and share more about how solar has become one of the cheapest ways to generate electricity. Next slide. So where does this misconception come from? Well, solar used to be much more expensive, but the price has dropped dramatically in the last decade. This graph shows how the price of solar photovoltaics, sometimes called PV for short, has fallen over time for both residential, referring to solar on homes, and utility scale solar. And for clarity, by utility scale solar, I'm referring to larger projects that feed into our electrical grid, supplying a utility with electricity. The decline in cost has been particularly notable for utility scale solar. In 2010, utility scale solar cost more than 6 times as much as it cost in 2022, as you can see on this graph. And this is a very significant price decline in just 12 years, which has significantly changed the economics of solar. Next slide. So how does solar compare to other ways that utilities generate electricity? We're all concerned about the cost of electricity that we purchase from utilities. But as it turns out, compared to traditional power plants, solar is a cheap way for utilities to generate electricity. In fact, solar has fallen in cost so much that it is cheaper to build new solar than it is to continue operating existing coal plants. This graphic is from a study which found that 99% of all existing coal-fired power plants in the US are more expensive to operate moving forward than it would be to replace them with new renewable energy projects, either wind or solar. Essentially, coal has become so expensive and solar has become so affordable that in many cases, it is cheaper to build an entirely new solar project than it would be to continue operating an existing coal plant. Next slide. And most of the time, solar is cheaper than building new gas plants. Recent analysis found that a clean energy portfolio made up of a mixture of solar, wind, battery storage, energy efficiency, and demand flexibility could provide the same service to our electricity grid for cheaper than over 90% of proposed gas plants. And if that clean energy portfolio were designed to use the maximum amount of federal tax credits, it would be cheaper than it would be a cheaper alternative to 99% of new gas plants. So in reality, the data shows that solar is one of the cheapest ways that we have to produce electricity. While I've mainly focused on utility scale solar tonight, the cost of solar for homes, small businesses, farms, churches, and local governments has also fallen dramatically, especially given the availability of new federal tax credits. And we'll be discussing this more in the upcoming 2 webinars that are part of this series. With that, I'll pass it to my colleague, Juhi Modi, to discuss our next misconception. Thank you.
Thanks, Naomi. Good evening, everyone. My name is Juhi. I'm a field coordinator, and I'm based in North Carolina. And today I'm going to be talking about safety and solar panels and what actually is in solar panels. There's a lot of misinformation about this, and it largely comes from lobbyists from the oil, gas, and nuclear industries. Next slide. So what are solar panels actually made of? There's 2 main types of solar panels. The majority of the ones that are used today are crystalline silicon, which is the type on the right, the type on the left. And then there's also cadmium telluride panels. So by weight, 99% of a solar panel is glass, aluminum, and polymers, plus silicon for the type on the left. As you can see, there are minute traces of copper, silver, and tin, and an even smaller amount of lead, less than 0.1% for crystalline silicon panels. And cadmium telluride panels have copper and cadmium telluride. The International Energy Agency has said that the amounts of copper, silver, and tin are not a threat to human health. And a 2019 study by Virginia Tech researchers confirmed the safety of cadmium telluride panels. And I'm going to talk more about lead and how manufacturers are trying to phase that out. People have been really thoughtful about managing any potential risks with these substances. And I'm going to go into 4 specific reasons why we can feel safe around solar panels. Before I get into that, I'm going to clarify that cadmium telluride is not cadmium. Cadmium is a toxic substance, but this is a different stable compound. Next slide, please. So the first thing that I'm going to talk about is there are very small amounts of these substances, like you saw in the graphics previously. A single lead acid car battery has more lead than 700 solar panels. A single shotgun shell has 2 times the amount of lead as 1 solar panel. And the layer of cadmium telluride that's used in panels is 3% the thickness of a human hair. When you compare the amounts of these substances to what we're exposed to from other industries, the potential risks are very low. Next slide. The second thing I'm going to talk about is how these materials are very well protected within solar panels. In order to comply with the 25-year warranty, what's inside of the panels are sealed airtight within layers of encapsulation. They're also protected with tempered glass, a polymer sheet, and strong plastic. And that's the same material that's used to make car windshields and hurricane windows really strong. So in the case that a panel were to break, they would still stay intact, even if they have cracks. Next slide. The third thing is there are many rigorous tests that solar panels go through before they begin their use. So for example, there's tests to see the resilience they have in hail, snow, wind, and other weather conditions, fire safety tests, and studies have shown that the substances that we've been talking about have not come out of solar panels during fires or storms. There's also been different experiments with panels being crushed by landfill compactors with a 50-ton load, and the crushed panels kept their encapsulation tight. Finally, the Environmental Protection Agency has toxicity tests to see if substances will come out of the crushed panels and into the groundwater. And this is used to help inform how the panels are going to be handled at the end of their life. Next slide. So it's really important to also think about this in perspective. And solar is much safer than the alternatives that we have. In a toxicity assessment, the United Nations found that coal poses a much higher risk than solar. Solar energy produces no greenhouse gas emissions, and when methane gas is burned, it produces greenhouse gas emissions. Burning coal pollutes the air and water and also creates coal ash. Coal ash has 25 toxic heavy metals and pollutants, including arsenic, mercury, and selenium. And so when we think about this from the bigger picture, solar is a lot safer for our communities than the alternatives. Next slide. The fourth and final thing I'm going to talk about is the fact that there's a lot of innovation in the field, and people are invested in making solar even more safe than it is right now. The industry is working on phasing out lead completely from panels. By 2026, less than 50% of panels are going to have lead, and they're going to continue until it's completely absent. Also, almost all of the cadmium telluride from old solar panels can be recycled and used in new ones. And you're going to hear more about this in just a second, and I'm going to pass it off to my colleague, Angie.
Thanks, Juhi. I'm Angie Mumal. I use she, her pronouns, and I'm the Middle Tennessee field organizer based in Woodlawn, Tennessee. And I am going to be talking about the misconception that solar panels will create a ton of waste and pile up in our landfills. As solar becomes more popular, concerns are growing over the issue of how we'll handle solar panel waste. Next slide, please. This concern should be placed in the context of how the amount of waste compares to other sources. Projections of panel waste are minimal when we compare that to other waste categories like municipal solid waste, coal ash, and plastics. And it was recently reported in a peer-reviewed scientific journal that as much toxic coal ash is generated globally in 1 month as solar panels are expected to produce in the next 35 years. So although the huge amount of waste we produce should definitely be a concern, solar panels are just a small part of a much larger issue. Next slide, please. The solar industry is already taking steps to tackle these concerns and reduce waste in several different ways. One is by extending the lifespan of panels. The industry standard for most solar panels today is a lifespan of 25 to 30 years. The National Renewable Energy Laboratory, NREL, already has technology to extend solar panel lifespan up to 40 years and is exploring ideas that could extend panel lifetime up to 50 years. Each additional year makes the cost of electricity produced by those panels cheaper and means we need to mine or recycle fewer raw materials. Another way they are addressing this issue is by finding alternative materials that are easier and quicker to manufacture. For example, most solar panels today are made using a process that is less energy intensive than in the past, and they can be manufactured more quickly and easily, which reduces energy consumption and reduces the amount of waste that's produced. And one of the best ways to tackle the concerns about panel waste is to recycle or refurbish used panel components. Next slide, please. Solar panels are already very recyclable, and there's a growing recycling industry developing around the recovery of materials for reuse. The bulk of solar panels consist of glass, plastic, and aluminum, 3 materials that are highly recycled already and have substantial markets in place to ensure these materials don't end up in landfills. Next slide, please. When panels reach the end of life, there are many companies that can recycle or even refurbish them. For example, companies like SolarCycle and First Solar break down panels and recycle the components for reuse. And there are also companies that specialize in refurbishing or reusing panels. Solar panels can be refurbished just how cell phones and laptops are, to restore them and give them a second life. This involves cleaning them up, repairing any physically damaged pieces, and replacing the thin polymer layer if needed. Panels can also sometimes be reused. For example, a panel no longer viable for use at a utility solar farm, maybe because after a decade of use, its electricity production has been reduced to 80% of its original capacity. It may be deemed replaceable by the company, and those panels can be reused as is at a private residence. Companies like We Recycle Solar and Good Sun help find new value in used panels and offer them at a discount to low-income communities. Next slide, please. Recycling is important for several reasons, and the Environmental Protection Agency and other organizations are working on programs to ensure solar panels are recycled. As the technology around recycling solar panels continues to advance, it will create even more jobs in the clean energy sector while reducing waste in our landfills and helping to create a more sustainable environment. So don't let the fear of creating solar waste keep you from going solar. And now I'll pass it over to my colleague Gabby to talk about our last misconception.
All right, thanks, Angie. And hello again, y'all. So who's heard this one? The concern about solar taking over rural farmland is something I hear really often, at least in Tennessee, where I'm based. And I get it, we are losing a lot of farmland, but solar is really not the driver of this. Next slide. Across the US, 11 million acres of US farmland were converted out of agricultural production over 15 years. That is significant. But according to the US Department of Agriculture and the Department of Energy, less than 1% of that was from solar development. Most is driven by urban and suburban expansion. But I'm not trying to minimize the amount of land use for solar. We know these projects can be really big, and a lot of acreage will be used for solar, is used for solar already. I'm just trying to add perspective on what's driving the vast majority of farmland loss. And what I want to emphasize next is that solar can be something that brings a lot of benefit to farmers, and there's a lot we can do to make solar an opportunity for restoring and protecting land. Next slide. So farmland tends to be cleared, sunny, and flat, so it's well suited for solar panels. We know this, and a lot of farmers who choose to lease some of their land for solar are excited about having a steady source of passive income for 20 or more years, depending on contract length. EnerWealth is a solar developer based out of North Carolina, and they're focused on small-scale projects, less than 30 acres, that bring rural community benefits. They've done a lot of work with Black farmers, including those pictured here. Next slide. And for one of the farmers interviewed in this article, the extra income was very attractive and will help her keep the land into the future. And we know children of farmers don't always want to take on farming that route, but they want to keep the land in their family for future generations. So this can be a way for folks to do that. And leasing for solar is more lucrative than crops at some US farms. Another North Carolina farmer from a different story said, "There's not a single crop we could have grown on that land that would generate the income that we get from the solar farm." So this can be really significant for folks. Next slide. And farmers don't always have to choose between solar and farming, thanks to agrivoltaics, which we'll hear a lot more about from Johnny Rogers in a minute. Solar can coexist with certain crops, grazing livestock, native vegetation, and pollinator habitat. And this photo on the left is of a solar project at a Virginia elementary school that's gold certified for pollinator smart habitat, and it's been meeting 95% of the school's energy needs. So we can advocate for things like pollinator habitat to be included with projects so they bring more ecological benefits directly to the land that they're on. Next slide. Lastly, but importantly, we can also reduce farmland use for solar by advocating for more siting on buildings like rooftops and already disturbed land like quarries, parking lots, and remediated brownfields, including closed landfills and former mine land. We've got a lot of that. So in summary, solar can bring farmers revenue, it can be combined with some agriculture, and it can be placed on brownfields and buildings. So with that, I'm going to turn it over to our first guest speaker, Mr. Johnny Rogers.
Hey, thank you, Gabby, and I appreciate the opportunity to be on this evening. Hope you can hear me okay. And I'll take the first slide. For some reason, I'm not seeing that. Am I supposed to be able to? There we go. Perfect. Okay, hope everybody can see that slide there. So yeah, I'm like Gabby said, I'm Johnny Rogers. I think you can go to the next slide there and we'll talk a little bit about who I am. I wear a couple of different hats, work for North Carolina State University Extension, as well as farming with my wife Sharon in Roxboro, North Carolina. We're just about 20 miles south of South Boston, Virginia. I know we have a lot of folks from Virginia on here, about an hour north of Raleigh. So we're kind of in the Piedmont of North Carolina. And we did, what you're not supposed to be able to do. We started a farm back in 2001, and we operated on leased land. For most of that time, we actually bought some land a little over a year ago that we're going to convert into a grass farm. And we kind of did everything on a low input basis. And you can see we are cattle people, but based on our enterprise mix, we're also easily distracted by other things other than cattle. So we've raised a variety of animals through the years, and you can see some of those enterprises have expiration dates, and there's reasons for that. We can certainly talk about it during the Q&A if we need to. So anyway, that's just a little bit about our context and who we are. So next slide, please. So this was the farm that we leased and moved on to back in 2001. It belongs to the Wagstaff family here in Person County, and we've had a great relationship with them. And that first blue arrow you see there on the left-hand side of the screen, that's the house that's on that farm, that's on the farm, and we actually live there. And man, you just can't beat the view and the location. It's just like your dream come true to be able to live in an area like this. At least for me, some people wouldn't like it. Now you can see there kind of in the bottom of the screen there. I know it's a little excluded on my my screen, but that was the first solar farm that the Wagstaff family told me they were going to build, and then the map's not been updated, so they actually built another one where that other blue rectangle is there to the right of the screen. I admit it. I thought the world was coming to an end when they told me they wanted to build that solar farm there. Not because it was solar, but because I thought it was going to have a negative impact on us as farmers. And I thought they would turn the whole place into a solar farm. But an interesting thing happened, and Gabby touched on it. My landlord told me that because of the income they're getting off of that, it's probably going to stabilize that tract of land for a significant amount of time, a much longer amount of time, not necessarily for the current generation of Wagstaffs, but the next generation of Wagstaffs. They might be interested in, leaving the whole thing as a farm. So it was interesting that Gabby brought that point up, and that's kind of the way it's worked out for us. But anyway, that's kind of where we live, and a little bit about our start with solar. Kind of rocky start, if you will. So next slide. So why would a solar farm owner, a company that has solar farms, why would they want to enter an agreement with a farmer? And hopefully I can, come in and hopefully make a case for that. Certainly there's other alternatives. Mowing would be one of those. So you need to control the vegetation. That topmost picture there, that's unacceptable by a long shot. They really don't want that to happen at all. That's not one of my solar farms. I found that on the web. So you can't have the panels shaded, and they really don't like things growing up underneath the panels and touching the bottom of the panels too. I think it makes them less efficient. It may involve some spraying of herbicides, both in and outside the solar farm. It is a sustainable, I think a sustainable system there, like all of pasture-based grazed agriculture is. Enhanced security on the site. I'll show you a couple slides here in a bit of where I have been the local first responder. Plus, for the solar company, it kind of gives them a positive story about the blending of solar and agriculture and agrivoltaics. And I think that's certainly something that they should, kind of look at and think about going forward. How can we better use all of our land? And I know some people say, well, why don't you just mow this and not worry about the sheep? And and then it kind of comes back to your burning fossil fuel with today's lawnmowers. And you can say, well, someday we'll have solar powered lawnmowers that are autonomous and, self-propelled. Hey, we've got them today. They're called sheep. So let's use them, Next slide. So here was a first responder incident on one of the solar farms during an ice storm. You can see there's quite a bit of damage there. We didn't have any sheep in there, but I, being a good service provider, well, I did go down and kind of inspect the farm and took some pictures and sent it off to the solar company, and they had it repaired. So that's just one of the examples. And I think there's maybe another picture on the next slide that kind of shows the same thing. Yes, this was a ice and snow event that the beams just kind of bent under the weight of the snow. So again, we took a picture of it, said, hey, this is row such and such, And so we try to provide that service, and we've had a good relationship with the solar companies we work with for that reason. Next slide. So what do I get out of this as a sheep farmer? Well, one of the things that you may not know about raising sheep is that they are very vulnerable to predators, particularly coyotes, the neighbor's dogs. A lot of things like to, get lambs. So a good secured fence pasture is the first line of defense against predators. So that's a good thing. And most of the time, and I'll show you a picture here in a moment where not all solar farms provide that, but for the most part they do. Free grass. There is no free lunch. Remember my college professor, economics professor, there is no such thing as a free lunch there. So, but it is very low cost grass, and shelter and shade. A lot of the pastures we have did not have any trees or natural shade. So sheep really don't like to be wet, and they certainly don't like to be hot, in direct sunlight. So solar panels do provide them, some comfort that way. Being paid for grazing and I should say, and mowing service. The biggest expense in any type of livestock production is feed, whether it's grazed or purchased feed of any kind. So I always like to say with solar grazing, we took our biggest expense and we turned it into a revenue stream. And that's certainly something that's worked out quite good for us. So next slide. Yeah, here's an example of a perimeter fence that does not, provide, and again, this is not a solar farm. I did snap that picture though, and we can go in with some, some additional fencing and make this, kind of sheep tight, where it would kind of keep the sheep in and at least slow coyotes down from entering the solar farm. Okay, next slide. The most important nutrient. Solar farms are built to be solar farms. They're not built to be grazing operations yet. Not up to this point, or some of the ones that are already built. Now, there are some new ones being built that we're having those conversations. Well, how can it be a better grazing facility, and a solar farm at the same time? So water availability, the good news is sheep don't require a lot of water relative to other livestock species like cattle. But if you're a considerable distance away, from your solar farms, that can be a problem. Could you kind of maybe work with some of the folks in the community of the municipality? I think some have worked with local fire departments or some folks in the neighborhood, so they don't have to haul water quite as far. Okay, next slide. One of the challenges of raising sheep, this is kind of the good, the bad, and the ugly, of raising sheep in solar farms, finding and counting sheep. If you had a 30-acre pasture out there in North Carolina and you had, maybe 30 sheep out there, you could probably walk out there at any moment in time, depending on the topography, and count your sheep and find them and count them all, right? In a 30-acre solar farm, well, you've got to kind of move around a little bit and walk around or ride around and kind of find them. So that makes it a little more challenging. Herding dogs can be a good thing. I know I've had folks suggest drones. We've not kind of went that far yet, but we typically keep our sheep. We do what's called tolling with feed. So that makes them pretty easy to gather, and we do that, and it works pretty well. It's not a terrible problem, but it is something that is different than a typical pasture. Okay, next slide. So everyone asks, hey, I've got a solar farm in our area. It's 50 acres, it's 10 acres. How many sheep should I plan on putting in there? And that's been a very difficult number to come up with. And typically we're saying 1 to 2 adult sheep, per acre is a good starting point. And there's just so much variation in the productivity of the land that these solar sites were built on. We grazed two that were just really good pastures before the solar farms were built, and then we grazed a couple more that were wooded areas that are just not as productive, at least up to this point. So some decisions are beyond your control. When we first started out grazing solar farms, we were only grazing. We were not mowing. So we would graze and then they would mow behind us because the sheep unfortunately don't eat everything. So one day I was letting the sheep, I was getting ready to put the sheep in the solar farm. I got up one morning and I heard a mower running at the solar farm. I said, oh my gosh, the solar company is cutting that beautiful grass that I was getting ready to turn my sheep out on, and they were. So that was one of those things. Now we do total vegetative maintenance. We do some mowing and grazing. So so that's kind of not quite as it doesn't happen anymore. You know, we've had a good relationship, and solar company personnel have been really good to work with, other than the couple of times they've left the gate open and our livestock guardian dogs or our sheep have escaped. It's only happened one time. Nobody was harmed, no animals were harmed, but it was a very stressful time. So I think the next slide will kind of show a way that we're addressing that. Yes, when our sheep are in a solar farm, you can see there's a tension. You know, there's sheep and livestock guardian dogs in here, and the guard dogs, remember I said coyotes, you know, like to get sheep. Well, the way you handle that is you meet teeth with teeth, and livestock guardian dogs kind of help that out. And you can see there, you know, you can open the perimeter gate, and then you can drive your truck in if you're a solar farm worker, and that temporary netting or temporary tape there kind of keeps the dogs from running out the gate and bombarding you a little bit. So that's something we tried to do. And when we don't have sheep in there, we fold the sign down so the solar workers know they don't have to worry about sheep or dogs in there. Next slide. Mowing. I admit it, I don't like to mow my yard. So getting me on a lawnmower and a solar farm is really not where I really enjoy it. And there's some solar farms that are easy to mow. That tractor and rotary cutter there in the background on the top slide, we can mow some solar farms, a lot of it with that. And that's fun to ride. Now that lawnmower in the foreground that my wife's on, not as much fun to ride that. But again, that's kind of our job. It's what we do. We appreciate the revenue and the opportunity to work with solar companies. It has made our farm more sustainable and more financially stronger to this point. So I think I don't know if there's a next slide or not. Oh yeah, there are some resources about solar grazing at the website, Center for Environmental Farming Systems. That's the umbrella organization within NC State that Amazing Grazing that I work for is coordinated under. So there's some solar resources there that hopefully will help you. And I think the next slide kind of just is a thank you and a real pretty picture of some sheep grazing a solar farm. So that's all I have. I look forward to our questions later.
Awesome. Thank you so much, Johnny. I will turn it over right now to Dr. Ronald Myers, our next guest speaker.
Hi, thanks. That's impressive, Johnny, all the work that you've done. And the rest of the panelists, I'm impressed with this information and data. Do we have a hard stop at 8 o'clock? Is that it? So I can go for maybe 5 or 6 minutes then? No. Okay, good. Let's do that. So I'm Dr. Ron Myers. I'm at Virginia Tech. As you can see, I'm actually in the Fish and Wildlife Conservation Department, and I'm also in public policy. And I became really interested in why solar projects were being cited so poorly, with terrible erosion, with such public opposition, that it began to look hopeless to achieve our renewable energy goals. And so when I said here at Virginia Tech, we need to build 250 megawatts of solar PV to repower our university as a moral obligation to our children and everybody else, people looked at me like I was crazy. So that's why I call this, can we flip the script? Can we find a way to sustainably site solar projects? And because of the work of many others, I think we're kind of on a good track. Next one. So clearly, poorly done solar has horrific impacts. And in Virginia, we've seen developers from the West who aren't used to rain like we have it, not used to our soils, create tremendous problems and come in and clear forest land. All kinds of problems. Next slide. So I went to a classic approach to figuring things out, sustainability, because when I looked at all the factors we had to consider in order to make a well-done facility, it was boggling. I reviewed the literature from my peers. No one was advocating for a synthetic, a comprehensive solution. So this was pretty obvious to come up with. I was surprised nobody else had done it. And you can see here the 3 pillars are economic development. What Johnny just talked about is part of the economic development, APV, to preserve farmland, to bring additional income to farmers. And in the case of the project that I'll talk about here, our proposal is actually to hire other local farmers to help us out. Environmental protection, if you do it correctly, you can actually improve the soil over time. You can avoid erosion and sedimentation. You can significantly enhance wildlife habitat. I'll show you how we did that. With social equity, a meaningful public engagement process is really key. I don't quite understand why industry is reluctant to engage the public earlier, other than anecdotally, their eyebrows go up and they express, well, won't they just let them get a head start to oppose us? And I'm like, no, it diffuses it, because people love to be asked what's important to them and to help design things. And so this is really what I spent a lot of time on as this 3rd step. Next slide, please. So here we go, a simplified diagram, if you can believe that. This ended up in an NSF application with the top row being mostly the existing process, the middle row being everything that we wanted to add in with public engagement to help develop what we call a site conceptual plan. And developers, I hope you're still listening, even though I gave you a little ding. I do like you. You're the key to making this work. And I actually want to de-risk your procedure, because over 90% of existing permits are held up at the local level for a year. It's amazing, on an average a year. And over 30% of projects fail, and I know that's painful. So this process is actually very inexpensive, but requires high expertise. And as third-party facilitators, they can help you through it. It only adds a couple months to the process, maybe 2 to 3, depending upon the size of the facility. And then you go back in the permitting process. What I'm advocating for is if you add in those couple months in a stakeholder process, your permit risk is significantly declined. So we're at the stages of the research where this has taken us about 5 years to do. And then I've pilot tested the process out at the Catawba Sustainability Center. Next slide, please. Twice now, once with a simplified version and a second time when the university paid me. One of the first times I know they paid faculty to do a real study on renewable energy here. And we went to the Catawba Sustainability Center, which sits right next to the Appalachian Trail. Is there a way for me to have my cursor go over it? I didn't prepare for that. Nah. Okay, so if you see that little line, yeah, there we go, at the top of the ridge there. Just go to the left. That is Catawba Mountain. No, not the one going down the hill. A little more up. I mean, downward to the left. Okay. So in any case, the Appalachian Trail is somewhere through there. And this is where we propose to put panels. Next slide. Well, the folks on the trail said, show us what it'll look like. It'll look terrible. So we went through a process with a landscape architecture firm with very sophisticated GIS with overlays of real photos of panels that were sized appropriately, oriented appropriately, heighted appropriately, in the appropriate colors. And we put them in those fields and we asked people, is this okay? And you can see in the background, the yellow circles, those are not very visible. But the second circle from the left, that one you can see some of the panels. So we drew the footprint of that. The next one over to the right, we reduced the footprint of that really by a half an acre. And those panels in the field below that, those were completely eliminated. So this is an example of state-of-the-art visualization that's been used in a public engagement process to help develop a site plan. Next one down, please. So we X'd out those sites. Next. And they were happy. Now, sure, this was a loss of the area, but we still get about 3 megawatts there. Let's see, next slide. Okay, nope, go back to the other one. I deleted one slide I needed. Fortunately, we had another 250 acres across the street owned by the state hospital. And that one, we went through a similar process and over 100 acres of it were found acceptable. Next. You've seen these photos before. I've got a long list of environmental conditions in our report, and I'll put the link for the report in the chat. And between the environmental conditions that can be put into permits, you can actually really improve wildlife habitat. Next. And this is our dream here at Virginia Tech of the faculty, is to grow food for the students and staff on campus who have food insecurity, sell a lot of the food to make money, raise livestock on the land, and improve wildlife habitat. So that's it. And I did take 8 minutes.
Fantastic. No, it was all wonderful content. And thank you so much, everyone, for the kind words in the chat too. And thank you to our guest speakers. We are going to jump into Q&A. So, keep them coming. If we get too many, we can hang on a couple extra minutes. Folks who want to hop off at 8 are welcome to do so. But I guess to start out, Angie, would you want to take on the question we got around solar being a solar-friendly state?
Yeah, sure. It looks like one of the questions, Dr. Myers answered, and Matt had responded to. Let's see, what questions were? Do you consider Tennessee to be a solar-friendly state? So that's a little bit of a tricky question, because individual cities can have ordinances against solar or wind projects. I would like to say that Tennessee is solar friendly. At least there are only a few cities that have ordinances against solar. And for example, there was a project not too long ago in Memphis, Tennessee, that was stopped because of an ordinance against solar. And that's kind of why we're doing this. And we want to get out, ahead of those issues and make sure that people who want to use solar are able to do that. And I will put in the chat, I noticed that Dr. Gia is here, who runs the Region 4 Tic Tac out of Memphis University. And he shared with me earlier a link that I'm trying to put in the chat. There we go. This is a link to actually an agri center that was able to use solar and has a solar farm. And if you go to that link, there's a video that provides some good information on solar energy use. And that agri center there does education programs. And so you may be able to find some more information there. Yeah, and I'll stop there and see what other questions we have.
Thank you, Angie. And I'll just add a little bit to address the net energy metering question verbally. It is certainly less cost effective in Tennessee without net energy metering. There are, new incentives through the Inflation Reduction Act, the Residential Clean Energy Credit. The Tennessee Department of Environment and Conservation is also working on programs for low-income residential solar. And we can advocate for community solar at our local power companies, which are allowed, to make some of their own energy, thanks with recent changes from TVA. But yeah, there are barriers that TVA doesn't have net energy metering. That is also something we can push to change. And there are still residents in Tennessee who are installing solar. We'll be prepared to dig into this more in the next webinar. Webinar 2 will be specifically about residential solar. So I guess just to lift up one of the questions that was answered in the chat, Dr. Myers or Matt, would you want to say anything more about the questions we were getting about migratory birds and solar panels?
Matt, I put in my 2 cents.
Yeah, so this was answered in kind of in the chat by Dr. Myers, and so it's important to recognize I guess there was 2 questions kind of in the chat. One was related to wind and migratory birds, and one was related to solar panels and kind of bird impacts and collisions. And as Dr. Myers kind of pointed out in this, those do occasionally happen on kind of large utility scale solar farms and kind of in places where there's migratory flyovers for birds and stuff like that. Kind of with that said, recognizing that it has happened in the past, there's strategies being developed and kind of utilized kind of moving forward that are lessening the chance of birds being getting confused, having any sort of impact with kind of the solar farms, the modules, the panels, so that they're kind of going forward with each iteration, there's less and less impact to birds. Recognizing that it's happened in the past is the first step. Fixing it and making it better with each iteration is kind of the next step. So it has happened, and strategies are being utilized to make it better.
Matt, I didn't see the question on wind. We had a horrific experience with mountain wind in West Virginia with birds and wind. And our office led the fight to have no wind in Virginia and the Appalachians. But they've since reconsidered that position because of a number of discoveries. We can predict when birds migrate, and we can turn turbines off. Put the 2 of those together with weather radar, you can actually track migrations. And the other thing that we found was utilities were not feathering their turbines. They were allowing them to rotate at 5 or 6 miles an hour when they weren't generating energy, but they were slicing up birds on occasion. So if you use these risk mitigation strategies, and these can be put into permits very clearly, as well as requirements to have wildlife biologists go out and monitor, the estimates are like a 98% reduction in bird and bat mortality. It's stunning. So with that, I turn it back.
Great. Thank you. For folks who see Janet's question in the Q&A, I'm curious, Johnny or Dr. Myers, especially if you have thoughts, I'll read it out. My org, Generation 180, is working with public schools in Pennsylvania to install rooftop solar. While many districts are on board, there's been a ton of pushback from community members not involved with the schools, possibly enough to block these school solar developments. I'll skip ahead to the question. Do you all have any advice on how to navigate these challenging, intense conversations?
Do you mind if I tackle that? Good. I like to say social scientists bring something, because the farmers and the engineers are doing great work and figuring those things out pretty well. And what we have to offer is absolutely correct that facts alone don't make a difference. What makes a difference is putting people in a room who care. And what oddly happens then is if you can get them agreed to have a civil conversation, which most people will agree to if you have them look in the face of their neighbors across a table, and you encourage them to form an agreement to be civil and to follow the facts, there will be a norming pressure. on the part of the people there. And if somebody wants to be very outspoken and non-factual, eventually they'll be kind of ostracized and people will really challenge them. So what we like to do is form these stakeholder groups when there's a real proposal and let people hash it out and do what we call joint fact finding and sort of raise their questions as questions and come back later with answers. Don't argue it all out at one meeting. Make it a process of people to appeal to their better natures. I know that's hopeful, but hey.
No, that was really helpful. So we are at 8. I'm gonna just ask Bruce's question that appeared in the chat for folks who may not have seen it. I don't know if I can add a question there. I'll put it in the chat again. And that'll be our last question. I do have a little bit to share about our upcoming webinars, just the dates, but feel free to hop off if you need to. So Augusta County recently passed an ordinance to prohibit farms from putting solar within 2 miles of an existing solar operation, saying Shenandoah Valley's beauty is at risk. Other concerns about solar bringing clay to the top, covering topsoil that will be vital after the solar is retired. Are these kind of arguments common, or do they reflect honest concerns or just an anti-solar mindset?
Well, I think it's a mixture. It's complicated, and that poorly designed developments do that. That's a problem. And the enormous developments that we saw in northeastern and southeastern Virginia were examples of how not to do it. And it's left a bad taste in Virginians' mouths. And on top of that, there is a significant amount of funding from literally the fossil fuel industry into funding astroturf groups who oppose solar. And they're making money off of doing that. And I'm not afraid to say it because it's very frustrating, the misinformation that they put out and the way that they try to keep a discussion from moving forward on what might work in their county. There are farms in that county that could be saved, as we heard from Johnny. There are ways that this can be done right. And some of these opposition groups are really problematic for that reason.
All right. Thank you.
Sure. Strong words from the professor, but they're frustrating.
It's really helpful insight. And I'll just close this out and remind folks that this webinar was the first in a 3-part series called Solar Simplified, and we hope you'll join us for the next 2, where we'll be diving deeper into some of the funding opportunities that can help make solar happen both on your home and in your community. And we'll be joined by some really awesome guest speakers for both. On April 10th, we're focusing on residential solar, solar for your home. And on April 24th, we'll be focusing on solar at community institutions with a panel of folks who have done the thing. So you can register on our website, and if you're on our email list, you'll be hearing more about them soon. So thank you so much for joining us, and we hope you have a lovely evening.